During the Cold War, both the United States and Russia um, developed programs that were rather crazy in order to stay one step ahead of the other in being able to mutually annihilate each other in the world. One of the most unusual was Project Pluto, and it undoubtedly was very, very strange. If you're a history buff, you probably already know that the space race between the United States and Soviet Union officially began on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets beat out the Americans by launching the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. Rockets that could lift satellites into space could also be used to launch nuclear warheads. In fact, the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik into orbit was originally designed to carry a nuclear warhead. The fear of falling behind the Soviets in this critical technology is what led the United States to create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958 and put the country on a course to the moon in the early 1960s. But back then, who knew for sure whether the United States would ever catch up with the Soviet Union in missile technology? What if the Russians pulled so far ahead that they developed missiles capable of shooting down American missiles? If the United States lacked the ability to retaliate against a Soviet first strike, what would that make a first strike that much more likely? American military planners decided that they had to have another type of weapon available if the Soviets ever developed the means to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. When ICBMs were launched, they leave the Earth's atmosphere for a time, and they then re-enter it at a point high above the target. And because of this, any Soviet anti-missile defense system would be aimed skyward to detect incoming missiles. One way to beat such a system would be to use a weapon that entered Soviet airspace at a very low altitude, treetop level if possible. It would also have to fly so fast that the Soviets couldn't shoot it down even if they did manage to detect it. The effort to come up with such a supersonic low-altitude SLAM missile became known as Project Pluto. Weapon designers came up with an 85-foot-long missile carrying anywhere from 14 to 26 nuclear warheads, and a ramjet engine powered by an unshielded nuclear reactor powerful enough to generate 500 million watts of electricity. Ramjets are designed to operate at 3 to 5 times the speed of sound. Their name comes from the fact that at those speeds the air is literally rammed into the engine as it travels through the atmosphere. And as the air enters the engine, it is compressed. Then the nuclear reactor heats the compressed air and causes it to expand, and the expanding air is exhausted out the rear of the engine, creating thrust. Because ramjets work only at very high speeds, the SLAM would have been launched with the conventional rocket boosters. The ramjet reactor would have been activated when the missile accelerated to 3 times the speed of sound. And once it was fired up, the nuclear reactor would have given the missile nearly unlimited range. It could have remained aloft for 35,000 feet in a holding pattern for weeks or even months on end, waiting for the command to proceed with or abort the attack. And if the attack order was given, the SLAM would have descended to 1,000 feet and proceeded to its first target. And when it arrived at the target, it would have ejected one of its warheads through a hatch on the top of the missile, like a giant flying toaster. In the time it took the warhead to fall to Earth and detonate, the SLAM would have cleared the blast zone and been on its way to the next target, and then the next, and then the next, and so on, until it ran out of warheads. That was how the SLAM worked on paper. Now, whether such a missile could ever really be built is questionable indeed. Traveling 3 to 5 times the speed of sound in all weather at the low altitudes where the air is the thickest would have exposed the missile to very high temperatures and atmospheric pressures. The unshielded nuclear reactor would have pushed temperatures even higher to well above 2,500 degrees. And well past the point where materials used in most jet and rocket engines would have melted. Even the special high-temperature materials the engineers did plan on using auto-ignited at just 150 degrees above the reactor's expected operating temperature. So if the SLAM ever ran even slightly hotter than expected, the missile could have burst into flames and disintegrated in mid-flight, showering highly radioactive material over a wide area. But a SLAM could be lethal without launching a single warhead. Traveling at 3 times the speed of sound at 1,000 feet would have produced a sonic boom strong enough to destroy buildings and kill people on the ground, and the unshielded nuclear reactor would have spewed deadly radiation over the surrounding region, no small consideration when it was expected that the SLAM would have to pass over countries allied with the United States on its way to the Soviet Union. The SLAM was a flying Chernobyl, so deadly, in fact, that the designers considered leaving the nuclear warheads out entirely, and after months of flying around in Soviet airspace, the radiation and sonic boom would have killed more people than the warheads ever could have. How would you even test something as deadly as a SLAM? There was no test site big enough to contain it, obviously, especially if it went out of control during flight. And even when the engineers tested the ramjet engine on the ground in 1961, they had to build the disassembly building 2 miles away from the test stand and operate both by remote control. The ramjet engine became so radioactive after firing that it would have killed anyone who got near it. The building where the engineers monitored the test by closed-circuit camera was even further away and included a nuclear fallout shelter stocked with a 2-week supply of food and water in case radiation levels rose so high that immediate rescue was impossible. The logic behind the SLAM concept was probably flawed from the beginning. Its success depended on using it in a surprise attack, but once it was launched and spewing sonic booms and giant clouds of radiation in its wake, how long could it possibly have remained undetected? Lucky for us, the Russians, and probably for everyone else on Earth, the United States pulled ahead of the Soviet Union in missile technology in the mid-1960s and scrapped the SLAM project before it even got off the drawing board.